This video concerns devolution in Northern Ireland. If you've already seen the videos on Scotland and Wales, they are far more straightforward processes, and there is a different, certainly recent history to them. And as you know, Northern Ireland is my particular area of interest and, dare I say it, expertise. And so you might forgive me if I go off on a tangent once or twice during this video. So devolution in Northern Ireland from 1998 is the result of a referendum. But that referendum was part of a wider peace process. And so the referendum for Northern Ireland was not on the topic of devolution alone. It was whether or not the people of Northern Ireland were approving of the Good Friday Agreement, which was an agreement, an international agreement signed by the governments of the Republic of Ireland, the United Kingdom, and the major parties in Northern Ireland at the time, signed in 1998, 25 years ago, and the referendum was sent to people both north and south of the border in Ireland as to whether or not they approved of the peace process. Now, 79% of people living in Northern Ireland voted in favour of the Good Friday Agreement. The one party at the time that campaigned for no was the Democratic Unionist Party. Now, there's two ironies to that. First of all, the DUP has had more First Ministers than any other political party in an assembly that wouldn't have existed had the DUP got its way in 1998. But another irony is that the DUP is now the party, at the time of recording in 2023, they are now the party that has stopped the process of a power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland. More on that later. So, unlike in Scotland and Wales, where assembly buildings were built after referendums in 1998, Northern Ireland already had a parliament building, and that's at Stormont, just outside of Belfast. And that's because Northern Ireland had its own parliament from 1921 to 1972. Now, the issue with that is it used first past the post to elect its membership, just like we do at Westminster, which marginalised the nationalist community and led to unionist dominance. In the late 60s and early 70s, the conflict known as the Troubles exploded, and political-inspired violence was common and increasing on the streets of Northern Ireland. And so in 1972, the executive was paused. Parliament was officially shut down in 1973. Now, post-Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Irish Assembly it was agreed that they moved back to those Parliament buildings in Stormont. At the time, Sinn Féin, the leading nationalist party in Northern Ireland, opposed moving back there because it had been a symbol of unionist dominance for 50 years. But eventually Sinn Féin relented. So from 1972 to 1998, we get what we call direct rule from Westminster. There is no parliament representing people in Northern Ireland. And the reason for that is that the Westminster government decided in the early 70s that the unionist-dominated government had failed to maintain peace in the north of Ireland, and so Westminster took it upon itself to rule from Westminster. So, as I said on slide number 1, the Good Friday Agreement came as a result of a peace process. Now, that peace process required the terrorist organisations in both communities to agree to a ceasefire, and also that both of those organisations surrendered their weapons. Part of the Good Friday Agreement installed a power-sharing devolved executive. And you can see there that the Northern Ireland Assembly doesn't use the flag of Northern Ireland with the red hand, or a Union Jack, or the Irish tricolour as its official logo. And that is because all of those flags are political symbols. So to raise the tricolour would be offensive to the unionist community. It would be seen as the flag of a foreign nation in Northern Ireland, whereas the Union Jack, or the Northern Irish red hand, would be seen as symbols of British or unionist dominance of the Catholic minority. So instead, on the logo, there are 6 flax plants, flax seeds. And that is because there are 6 counties that make up Northern Ireland. And also the flax plant, the flax seed, was used in the linen industry, which made the north of Ireland so wealthy in centuries gone by. But other complications of the Good Friday Agreement included the release of political prisoners. So many people who had been arrested and imprisoned for terrorist activity were walking the streets again. And that was a very sensitive issue, because you have murderers and attempted murderers, people who had committed acts of unspeakable violence, being freed and able to roam the streets as a result of a peace deal. And that seemed to some people to be ironic. But it was an issue that both paramilitary sides of the conflict would not budge on. So the IRA, or the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA, these terrorist organisations in both communities refused to take part in a ceasefire without their prisoners being released. And I'll give you the example of one, and that's of Michael Stone. Michael Stone turned up to a funeral in 1998. And on that day, he killed 3 people and injured 60. Now, the funeral was being held for 3 members of the IRA who had travelled to Gibraltar with the plan of setting off a car bomb on a street parade for British servicemen in Gibraltar. The British Secret Services knew about their plan, and they intercepted the car before the plan was put into place. And those 3 people were killed in gunfire with the Secret Service. So Michael Stone took offence to the fact that these people had a well-attended funeral, but he also knew that a large amount of prominent nationalists would be at that funeral at Milltown Cemetery in 1988. Gerry Adams, for example, was there. More about him in just a minute. And so Michael Stone threw grenades into the crowd and fired his pistol. He was a member of the UDA, a terrorist organisation loyal to the British state. And as in the investigation that followed, Michael Stone was also found guilty of another 3 murders prior to the murders he committed at the cemetery in 1988. He was convicted to 684 years in prison. He actually spoke with Mo Mowlam directly during the peace process, where he was campaigning for political prisoners to be released. He served 13 years of the 684 that he was convicted for before being released in the year 2000. 6 years later, Michael Stone was apprehended and arrested at Stormont for trying to bring a knife, a pistol and pipe bombs into the Stormont building, and he was found guilty of the attempted murder of 2 leading Sinn Féin politicians, Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams. And so Michael Stone has been twice attempted to take the life of Gerry Adams, a leading Sinn Féin politician with clear, sustained links to the IRA in its history. And so I hope that story can teach you a little bit about the sensitive history of Northern Ireland, and why this peace deal was controversial, but so many people in Northern Ireland considered it necessary for Northern Ireland to move on from its violent past. The irony being that the release of political prisoners like Michael Stone led to violent threats against the Northern Irish Assembly, which had also been created as a result of that Good Friday Agreement. So, there are 90 MLAs, members of the Legislative Assembly, and unlike Scotland and Wales, which uses AMS, the Northern Irish Assembly uses single transferable vote. And that is because there must be power sharing in the Northern Irish Assembly. There must be a unionist and a nationalist political party sharing power, which means that every political party and everyone elected to Stormont must declare themselves as unionist, nationalist or other. So, for example, the DUP, the Ulster Unionists and the Traditional Unionist Voice, the clue's in the name of all three of them. If there's a U in the name, they're a unionist political party and they identify as unionist. The two major nationalist parties in Northern Ireland are Sinn Féin and the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party. There is one prominent political party that declares itself as other, and that is the Alliance Party. And again, the clue's in the name with Alliance. The Alliance Party want to move beyond unionist and nationalist politics. They think that for Northern Ireland to have a bright future, it must move beyond the divisions of the past of orange and green, of unionist and nationalist. But there's another political party that declare themselves as other, and that is the People Before Profit Party. And members of the Legislative Assembly for that party have in the past declared themselves socialist rather than unionist or nationalist. So, right now, Northern Ireland, at the time of recording, on the 5th of April 2023, does not have a First Minister and a Deputy First Minister. In theory, Michelle O'Neill should be the First Minister of Northern Ireland, and it would be a historic moment because it would be the First Minister from the nationalist community. The Deputy First Minister should be Geoffrey Donaldson of the Democratic Unionists. And on the next slide, I'm going to explain to you why that isn't the case. But just to run through Northern Ireland's First Ministers, and if you listen to the names of the political parties, you'll start to see a trend. So the First Minister for Northern Ireland was David Trimble of the Ulster Unionists from 1998 to 2002. And then the next four First Ministers, Ian Paisley Sr., Peter Robinson, Arlene Foster and Paul Given, all reigned as First Minister between 2007 and 2022. And all four of those politicians, Paisley, Robinson, Foster and Given, were members of the Democratic Unionist Party. So since power sharing was introduced, there have only ever been unionist First Ministers. So if we know that the First Minister comes from one community, the Deputy First Minister must come from another. So from 1998 to 2001, the SDLP's Seamus Mallon was Deputy First Minister, and the SDLP replacement for Seamus Mallon in 2001 was Mark Durkan from 2001 to 2002. 2007 to 2022, Martin McGuinness and Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin were the Deputy First Ministers. And what we see in Northern Ireland, as well as the dominance of the DUP as First Minister, as opposed to Deputy First Minister, what we see is individuals like Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, who were on the fringes of politics earlier in their political career. The DUP were not the major unionist party, it was the Ulster Unionists. But after power sharing, rather than bring communities together, it seemed to be the extremes in each community that started to become more popular at the ballot box. So the DUP replaced the more moderate Ulster Unionists as the major party on the unionist side. And Sinn Féin replaced the SDLP. Again, the SDLP being a more moderate alternative to Sinn Féin. And Martin McGuinness, very much linked to the power hierarchy of the IRA in the 1970s and 80s. Much like Gerry Adams, both he and Martin McGuinness, both Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, moved into the political arena and started to move away from political violence and started to argue that the way for the real change that people wanted, and certainly a peaceful political change, was to embrace the political method rather than to continue to go down the road of violence. So, on the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why Michelle O'Neill is not Sinn Féin's First Minister and Geoffrey Donaldson is not the Deputy First Minister. Despite those titles being different, they are the same powers. So this was another long negotiation in the Good Friday Agreement. The Unionists believed that they would always have a majority and so wanted that position to be clear. They wanted the distinction between First Minister and Deputy, even though the powers were exactly the same. Sinn Féin rejected that. They didn't get, certainly the nationalist parties wanted the phrase co-First Minister or joint First Minister. They didn't get that, but the nationalist community would often refer to the joint or co-First Minister to inform their to inform their followers and to inform the wider community that these roles are exactly the same. So even though you see First Minister and Deputy, they share the same powers. But for the Unionist community, both then and now, it comes with the symbolic importance of being the First Minister, the biggest party, and not second place. So, whereas we've seen in Scotland and Wales devolved powers increase and general political stability, that the same cannot be said of Northern Ireland. In recent years, power sharing has been paused on 2 occasions. The first is the so-called cash for ash scandal. And you can see there on the right, outside 10 Downing Street, Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin and the DUP's Arlene Foster. Now that speech and that meeting there at Downing Street came before power sharing was paused. So the cash for ash scandal cost the people of Northern Ireland nearly £500 million. And it was a scheme which paid applicants to use renewable energy. The scheme was set up in 2012 to encourage businesses, particularly in the farming industry, to use renewable energy to reduce the carbon footprint of Northern Ireland. However, the subsidy that these businesses and these individuals received was larger than the energy costs. So people were making money from using the scheme. What it led to is reports of farmers heating empty barns, because you are making money by heating that barn, even though there's no purpose for it. And the minister at the time in 2012, who was responsible for it, was Arlene Foster. By 2016, when the scandal emerged, Arlene Foster is First Minister of Northern Ireland. And she faced calls to resign, but she refused to do so. And so Martin McGuinness resigned himself, because power sharing in Northern Ireland needs 2 parties to share that power. And so Martin McGuinness resigned in protest, which shut the executive down, which meant that effectively Arlene Foster had to resign from post 2, even though she had refused to do so because of protests about this energy scheme in which she had been in charge of. So Sinn Féin, after the resignation of Martin McGuinness, refused to replace him with another minister to take on that role of Deputy First Minister. And that caused the power sharing executive of Northern Ireland to collapse for 3 years. So in 2017, power sharing collapsed because of a protest by the nationalist Sinn Féin. But in 2022, it was the turn of the DUP to refuse to enter a power sharing executive. Now, this is set against the backdrop of the Assembly election of 2022, in which, for the first time ever, Sinn Féin finished first. For the first time in a Northern Irish election since the creation of Northern Ireland in 1922, for the first time, a nationalist party was the biggest party in Northern Ireland. And that was huge news in that part of the world. Northern Ireland was set up, and in the 1920s and 30s, Unionists were talking of a Protestant land for a Protestant people. And here we are now with the nationalist Sinn Féin, the biggest party in Northern Ireland. And census data in the same year had shown that there were more Catholics living in Northern Ireland than those that identified as Protestant for the very first time. And so we must see this next shutdown against that backdrop, because unionism is beginning to fear the beginning of the end of Northern Ireland. So, officially, the DUP refused to enter power sharing over their concerns over the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was a plan already in place, agreed by Boris Johnson as Prime Minister and in a trade deal with the European Union. Boris Johnson had promised the DUP that there would be no border on the Irish Sea. Boris Johnson gave his word to the DUP, no border on the Irish Sea. That promise wasn't kept. And goods travelling into Northern Ireland, whether they were going to the Republic or not, were all being checked. And so the DUP, if you are to believe the DUP's account of it, refused to enter power sharing in protest of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But if you were perhaps a bit more cynical, you might argue that the protocol gave a convenient excuse for the DUP not to enter an executive in which they would have the Deputy First Minister. As I said previously, these positions have the same power, but the DUP has always taken pride in the symbolic prestige that comes with being the biggest party in Northern Ireland. So, Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris, you can see him pictured on the right there, has extended deadlines. So what happens essentially is if a unionist, the biggest unionist party, refuses to enter, they have a period of negotiation before the British government calls for another election in Northern Ireland. And the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland did not want that, particularly because of the timing of it. The October deadline would have meant an election around Christmas time of 2022. And at a time of a cost of living crisis, it would have been seen as a grand waste of money to hold another assembly election when the DUP's reaction has been not to enter the executive based on the protocol. So the deadline has been extended until April 2023. The DUP has until the end of April to decide whether or not it is going to enter a power sharing executive. Now, one change has been that the Northern Ireland Protocol has been replaced with the so-called Windsor Framework. So there are two lanes now. If you are taking goods from the mainland into the EU, essentially the Republic of Ireland, so if you have goods destined to go to the border or beyond the border to the Republic, you enter the red lane and you go through full procedures, full checks. And in Northern Ireland, if your goods are going into the United Kingdom, if they're staying north of that border, there is less forms to be filled in. It is hoped that that will make the DUP and certain elements of the unionist community feel as if Northern Ireland is being treated like the rest of the UK. But so far, the DUP has refused to come out to back the Windsor Framework. So who knows when that pause to power sharing will end. Just on a note to end things, the Alliance Party want to change the rules. And again, if we look at the 2022 elections, Alliance finished third. But under the current rules, Alliance could never have a minister, a first minister or a deputy first minister. They can take ministerial jobs, but they cannot take the first or deputy job. And that is because Alliance identify as other. They don't identify as unionist or nationalist. So what Alliance want to do is they want to change the rules. They first of all want it to be the two largest parties that go into power sharing, which would allow the Alliance Party, if it ever finished second, to have a first or deputy first minister. But what they also want to do is change the rules to stop any of the two largest parties from holding up democracy in Northern Ireland. What they want to do is have a time limit for the parties to agree to an executive, and if one of those two parties refuses to do so, then the party that came in third would be able to take its place. So under the current rules, Alliance can't do anything about it. It can't have a first or deputy first minister, but it hopes that there will be a significant rule change in the future which would allow it to play a greater role. And the growth of the Alliance Party actually suggests, particularly amongst those living in the cities like Belfast, certainly, but also younger Northern Irish voters, there is a growth away from unionism and republicanism and more towards an identity as beyond one of those two communities and identifying not as one thing or the other, but possibly as Northern Irish. And finally, just like we've discussed for Scotland and Wales, we'll talk about nationalism and independence in Northern Ireland. Unlike Scotland and Wales, it wouldn't be an independent Northern Ireland that nationalists would desire, but a reunification of the island of Ireland, and that the North would join the Republic. So, just like it did in Scotland, Brexit threw up a complication because the people of Northern Ireland voted in a majority to remain in the European Union, whereas the wider United Kingdom, of course, voted to leave. And so certainly in the nationalist community, there were growing calls for a reunification with the Republic in line with membership of the EU. Now, calls for Irish unity have preceded the existence of Northern Ireland, in the sense that there has been an Irish identity and a feeling that the people in the north of Ireland are not British since before Northern Ireland even existed. And the nationalist community has campaigned and identified as Irish and campaigned for unification since the very creation of Northern Ireland. So the debate is less around an independent Northern Ireland and more about reunification. In December 2022, a poll by the Irish Times found that 50% of those polled in Northern Ireland wanted to remain part of the UK, and just 27% wanted reunification of Ireland. This will not put nationalists off. They will continue to campaign for unity one day. And what's interesting is that there is a stronger majority for unification in the Republic of Ireland. 2/3 of voters in the Republic want to unify North and South. But as it stands, looking at the polling data, there still seems to be a majority in favour of Northern Ireland remaining in the UK even after Brexit.